Hi, everybody. I'm president of Cornell Students for Animal Rights. My name is Chloe, and I am honored to present T. Colin Campbell today. T. Colin Campbell studied at Cornell and he studied graduate school at Cornell, and he started his career here in 1956 and worked here until 1961. He has a postdoctoral and sabbatic studies at MIT, Oxford University, and Virginia Tech, and he returned to Cornell as a full professor with tenure in 1975. He's probably best known for his popular trade book, The China Study, which was published in 2005, and it's a New York Times and the New York Times bestseller Whole, published in 2013. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce our speaker, Dr. T. Colin Campbell.
Thank you so much, Chloe. Let me put my, where is it here? Got to dress up with the things I usually dress up with. Can you hear me? No? Yes. How about that? Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay, good. Well, thanks very much, Chloe and Isabel, for making this arrangement for the lecture here. And I know many of you have heard this before or something similar, working in this area. I've been at it for a long time, as Chloe said. Now it's been 63 years ago this August when I came here to Cornell to do my graduate studies. And came back in '75, so I've been here, spending most of my career working here on the question especially having to do with food and health. My training was in nutritional biochemistry. Oddly, it was up in Stocking Hall, to be honest about it, in the animal science department, animal nutrition particularly. And so I came here with certain views, if you will, that have actually radically changed. And over the years, I had a large group of students. I had lots of opportunities to explore different things, plenty of funding to do research, that sort of thing. And so I wandered all around the place, but all had to do with food and health. And also learned along the way that many of you may know that nutrition, quite frankly, is kind of confusing for a lot of people. At least if you read the daily newspaper and read the claims that are being made and on the media in general, and they're at odds. And I have been troubled, to be honest about it, by the fact that this topic is so confusing, yet is so important. That's the point I want to make. And it's a topic that has reasons for being confusing. And in fact, I'm right now involved in finishing up another book exploring that question. Why is it so confusing? Why has the profession sort of neglected this topic of nutrition, when I would argue that of all the sciences, certainly all the biological sciences, there's got to be at the top. It should be at the top. So with that said, I want to start out with this title. Let's call it the rebirth of nutrition. I'm not sure it ever had a birth before. So this might be a new renaissance, I guess you could say. Because what I've learned about this topic of nutrition, which basically is a biological expression of the food once consumed. So it's different from the word diet. Diet is a general array of foods that we tend to consume as a routine. Nutrition is basically what's going on inside of the body, essentially, and involves infinite numbers of things that I'll get into. So I have a rather distinctly different idea than I did before on more than one account. Obviously, I started out with some views about what kind of food to eat, but now I'm really almost possessed, if you will, with the idea that in terms of the biology, in terms of the science of the nutrition, there's a new way we can think about it in order to try to, if you will, get to the point of understanding better what nutrition is and appreciate it and recognize, too, how much impact it really can have in the world today in a number of different fronts. So let's move on then and give you just a brief statement about where I got going in the way I did that eventually led to a 90-degree turn, 180-degree turn, I should say. In those years there, 65 to 74, I was at Virginia Tech. And when I joined that faculty, the Department of Nutrition and Biochemistry, the director of the department who recruited me to come, he and I then got involved and organized a project in the Philippines addressed to the question concerning how do we develop in a poor country like that, a program, let's say, that would work towards helping to solve malnutrition problems. And so that's where the first idea came along, that possibly I was being taught and learning things that weren't exactly what I thought they were. So what I happened to have seen, and it's totally anecdotally, that was not published, it was just this idea that the children who we were working with to try to sort of make things better, if you will, there were two main ideas that we in the international nutrition sort of had. And that was in these poor countries, from a nutritional perspective, and in terms of the malnutrition that occurred, it was occurring either because they weren't getting enough calories, that's just not enough food, if you will, or they weren't getting enough protein. Those are the two ideas. And the question that I happened to thought I saw was that the idea that there were the families who were consuming the most protein like we do, and that's what we went to the Philippines for, to sort of figure out ways how they could get more protein. The few families that were eating like we did, I seemed to got the impression that they were the ones who had children more likely to get liver cancer. Really odd thing. It wasn't totally my idea. As a matter of fact, it was my two medical colleagues who told me that one day on the golf course, that they were operating on children age 4 and under for liver cancer. And I thought that was really strange. And wearing my hat in the nutrition area, on the other hand, as I say, I got this impression that the children most likely to get liver cancer also were the ones consuming the most protein. They were the richer families eating the Western kind of diet and so forth. So here we are, going to the Philippines to make sure all these children, especially the malnourished children, got enough protein on the one hand. On the other hand, here's an idea that obviously was not consistent with what we wanted to do. So I came back home again in Virginia Tech at that time and got some research money from NIH to organize a basic research study to see, is that true that higher protein is associated with more cancer? I mean, that was out of the ballpark, and I'm sure you can appreciate that. And so just with that doubt in my mind, obviously major doubt, this paper came out too. It was a study of experimental animals where these Indian workers, in this case, happened to have had the idea that they wanted to understand how liver cancer works, like I did. But they had the impression that one way, maybe to slow it down, maybe prevent it, more protein. Such was the reputation of protein in those days. Protein is everything, and we could solve everything. If we don't get enough protein, we're going to have all sorts of problems, so the story went. And so they did this little study in which involved the experimental animals, rats in this particular case, and they basically were creating cancer in these animals, if you will, by exposing them to a chemical carcinogen, actually a very potent one, the most potent chemical carcinogen known in those days. And they decided to sort of divide them into two groups, feed one a higher level of protein, which quite frankly was a regular level, that's 20% of total calories, as opposed to a lower level of protein, with the hypothesis that the animals given the higher levels going less cancer, okay? All of them were exposed to the carcinogen. So here's the results they got. It was exactly the opposite. The animals given the higher levels of protein, these are not exorbitant levels. They're in fact in the range where a lot of us might reach, actually. And 100%, small study, not that impressive, but nonetheless, the size of the effect was impressive. 100% of the animals getting the more protein actually all got cancer, early cancer and mid-cancer, if you will. The animals getting the lower levels did not, in spite of the fact that both got to carcinogen. That, in turn, triggered then for me an idea that here I'm seeing these children, not sure what I'm seeing, not really believing it, to be honest about it, But with this, you kind of have to stop and ask, especially when we're there to promote consumption of more protein. This was out of the ballpark. It's essentially is that idea. Actually, these researchers didn't believe what they did. They went back and did the study another way, and actually alleged to have shown that the opposite effect was true. It pleased them, at least. And that they didn't come to terms with that at all until some 25 years later, when they invited me to speak in India and offer this alternative idea. So there's what you have: it. High protein, more cancer. In this case, specifically liver cancer, if you will. So that brought me back to still yet another baggage I was bringing with me. Not a baggage, I shouldn't say it that way, but it's sort of some bias in my background. I was raised on a dairy farm. We were producing milk. And the protein that Indian workers are using to turn on the cancer was the main protein of cow's milk. Now you can see that the cheese is becoming more binding. Not a very good metaphor in this case, but in any case, that's what it was. More protein, more cancer. And then I was here at Cornell and following up on that sort of precondition, if you will, developing a PhD doctoral dissertation research project with my professor, essentially. And it was an attempt here at Cornell to show that protein is really important. Let's figure out more ways. That's what that project was designed to do. Let's figure out some more ways that we might be able to improve on the production of animal protein, in this case. So that's what it was. So that's my background. So getting into the research project that we then started to do, we did it in many different ways. And what I'm talking about here basically is dozens of ways that we conducted this. This is not a single study. We did a first study, a second study, and so forth and so on, but we kept building on it. And when we got into that kind of research, however odd that was, you know, in experimental animal, rats, and getting liver cancer, that's pretty narrowly focused. But nonetheless, it was a good model to study how cancer forms. To study, in this case, how nutrition might relate to cancer. So we did some studies, and I'm going to show you just 3 or 4 little slides to sort of hit the highlights. Because this is the point I want to make. I'm going to touch on some highlights that to me show, in effect, how important the subject of nutrition is. We're going to focus a little bit on how nutrition relates to cancer, but the same story to a great extent can be also told as to how nutrition relates to heart disease, diabetes, and the rest of it. So, okay, here's what we have. Little study, 12 weeks, experimental animals, rats in this particular case, starting out with a genetic mutation, as I'm sure all of you know. That's how cancer starts. Create a mutation. Mutation in a gene that is possible once converted into a cancer cell is then capable of growing into cancer. So we start out with a genetic mutation and give them 20% protein, just like the Indian workers had done. And these early cancers are going rather nicely, you can see. All the animals getting cancer. Animals given 5%, none dead. So here's a start in sort of documenting, if you will, or at least replicating what, in fact, the Indian workers had done. Now I'm getting more and more interested in this. I got a grant from NIH to do this, I should tell you. The National Institutes of Health, I'm sure you probably know. And that grant I got, which was pretty competitive at the time, sold on the idea I wanted to understand cancer, not study nutrition. But in any case, I got that grant. That was repeated then, kept being repeated for the next 27 years. So I had pretty generous funding during these years to do all kinds of things to explore. So there you see that result, and I think you can see that's pretty impressive. That's a big effect. So then there were different ways of exploring that question. Some of them are fairly significant questions, of course. One way was, let's say, we simply asking the question, what would happen if we switched the diet during that first 12 weeks? It's a rather obvious thing to do, I think. First 3 weeks, as you can see, the cancers are growing. 20% protein. We switched the diet to 5%. Turned it off. Turned it back on. Turned it off. That was so striking in those days, nobody wanted to even talk about the possibility that this experimental cancer could be controlled in this way, simply by nutritional means. fairly modest changes in nutrient intake in this case. In this case, the protein, of course, is the nutrient in question. But we did that, as I say, we did that so many times, became so convinced, I will dare, and you can't, this is irrefutable. No one can show the opposite effect because it's so pronounced. So cancer develops, let's say, from nutrition, not mutated genes. I'm going to come back to that point. It arises because of nutrition, because here they had the genes, okay? They had the genes, and just they got the cancer because of nutrition, not because of the genes, even though the genes are required. But that kind of thing happens all the time anyhow, so it's not that terribly important. So here's another way to look at the same thing that I found really exciting. Same outline. In this case, what we did, we started out with animals fed, they're exposed to a carcinogen that gives rise to cancer. The most feared of all carcinogens in those days. Give them 5% for 9 weeks, if you will. I thought by that time it's possible those mutations that were formed early on, they're now gone. The body got rid of them. And if you then gave them, say, more protein, you wouldn't see anything anyhow because it's now gone. It's all the problems solved. Give them 20% protein, turn it back on again. That's analogous. When I was seeing these things, of course, you can keep your focus on a very narrow track, just on liver cancer in rats. Kind of a silly thing to maybe study, but I was looking for all the time for illustrations of possible principles by which cancer forms, principles by which nutrition, in this case, interacts with the cancer. So anyhow, there you have it. It leads to this sort of what should I say? I guess you could call it a metaphor in a sense. It's sort of like growing grass. You have all your seed bed, spread seeds all over the soil. And the more seeds you put on, the more grass you get. Okay, so now the grass is going to grow, but it grows only if it's getting sunshine, right temperature, some water. In other words, once it's fertilized. The same thing has happened here. The mutations that are formed are staying there. They didn't go away. They have the potential to grow into cancer. And only when they're fertilized with the appropriate nutrition, they start growing. This is a strikingly different point of view for how cancer forms. And in those days, it was out of the box. No one even was proposing anything like this because, as I said, cancer is regarded as a genetic disease, it's not a nutrition disease. But it was exciting for me because we're seeing things that are big effects and unusual effects. So there's what it is. Mutated cancer cells may lie dormant until awakened by nutrition. I can tell you, jumping way ahead with all kinds of other data I won't show, we all have some genes that have been mutated. It's happening all the time. We got some mutated genes that are lying there dormant, if you will, for the most part, fortunately, that could grow into cancer if, in fact, we feed them. That's the sort of the broader concept, broader context of what this suggests. And as I said, the protein in this particular case that was being used by the Indian workers and us, it was really the only protein we could get on the market, to be honest about it. So I didn't pay a lot of attention to what protein it was, and that wasn't the issue. I just wanted to get some protein and try these experiments, and the protein we were using, the main protein, cow's milk. Well, I can tell you, coming from the dairy farm, and then up in Stocking Hall, working on a project to promote the consumption more of milk and dairy and eggs and meat. This is pretty striking. And then on top of it, at the same time, being in the Philippines, trying to get these kids to have more protein, like we do in the West, like everybody wanted to do. I mean, this is pretty challenging, not knowing really what to do with it. So at that point, some years later, I had a couple of students do a couple of studies just asking another question. And that was, what if we try some plant protein in this? Just a couple more proteins. A lot of people, incidentally, still today, unfortunately, but a lot of people tend to think that word protein means something coming from animal foods. I call it animal-based protein. And so now we know that plants have protein too. In fact, that's been known for quite a long time, kind of ignored. But in any case, so we tried a couple of plant proteins. Soy protein and whey protein did not increase the cancer, even though it's fed at the 20% level. So here's something striking. Again, big effect. Plant proteins do one thing, animal proteins do something different. This is very specific. We only got 2 proteins here, being compared in one animal protein. That's not very impressive in that sense, but the effect is big, and I can tell you now with lots of data, I can't show here now, animal proteins tend to do that. Animal proteins as a group tend to stimulate cancer growth, among other things that we don't like to have. Plant proteins, in contrast, don't do that. So there's, again, a sort of an idea to tuck away, thinking about, one more metric or one more sort of principle, if you will. So I'm offering this as a hypothesis in this case. We can hypothesize anything, as many of you may know, in science, but this is a suggestion of, an idea that's worth exploring, namely that animal proteins promote disease formation, plant proteins prevent and reverse disease formation. Notice I said they're disease. I'm already now venturing into some new territory. I'm not talking about just cancer. I'm talking about the idea, a broad class of proteins from animals or plants, if you will, or having this very generalized effect. I won't have time to get into that, but I'll return to comment on that later because it's kind of exciting to think of it that way. So cancer is primarily a nutrition-determined disease, not a genetic-determined disease. That, in those days, that was really tough to talk about this. Animal protein, cow's milk protein, increasing cancer, even if it's in rats. I mean, to even think about the possibilities enough to sort of get you canned, if you will. Now, these days, have become even more significant because now the entire cancer industry, which was my main interest in many ways, and really part of my career, the main theme that underlays the entire cancer industry, whether it's in prevention or whether it's in treatment, either one, the main theme that underlies that disease from a scientific point of view is cancer is a genetic disease. Let me show you here, right there. The National Cancer Institute of the NIH, they were the ones funding my research all these years. And they kept reviewing, and I got good marks on it. We published it extensively and all that sort of stuff. We were still floating along going well, but I was selling the idea at that time, not necessarily intentionally, but after all, we're getting money from cancer. I was selling this study on the grounds that we were studying cancer, which I was. We were only using the protein to kind of change the course of the cancer development. That was the point. It was kind of an experimental trick to see how things worked that way. But it turned out, as you know, at the end of the day, it was the protein that was the main feature. It wasn't at the beginning, but it became the main feature of this research. So the National Cancer Institute, huge behemoth organization, billions of dollars. This is the largest institute in the world that provides funding for cancer. They say right up front, right here you see how cancer rises. Cancer is a genetic disease that is caused by genes to control the way of your cells function, especially, notice this, especially how they grow and divide. That is the basis for the entire cancer industry. And I'll tell you why in a little later. It's so profound, they make it right up front. They want everybody to know that. I'm saying it's wrong. It's just simply wrong. Or at least it can be challenged in a very serious way, and for the most part, that's not true. Even though all cancers more or less start with genes, that's fair enough, mutations. But there's so many mutations going all the time. This is sort of happening to do this thing. And we have the genes there to cause whatever disease we might want to get, cancer included, of course. We have all the genes there, all the makings of the startup place, but it's the question of nutrition, whether it really occurs. So now I want to move again. Again, I'm looking for principles that I find to be very profound. I want to come back to define what I think about nutrition, the way it is and the way it isn't. So this question you're concerned about, it took about 15 years to get a lot of this information here I'm going to show you. But I wanted to ask the question, some crazy idea like this, protein turned on cancer, animal protein, we had to know how it worked. My training is in biochemistry to a great extent. I was in the biochemistry department, and I wanted to know which enzyme is being altered that cause that effect? Which, let's say, transport mechanism? Which something else, at the molecular level? Which kind of thing might be changing? And how does it change in order to account for this protein effect? So we started looking for things. Before I tell you those details, that spread across there at the top, right here, that's just an arbitrary display of the progression of cancer over time. So it's a time scale. And in research, we tend to think about cancer in terms of 3 different divisions. We got a first case where the cancer starts, initiation. That's just when the mutation is forming. It's a complex process, by the way. That's where that's going on. The second one is promotion. That's what we all talk about. That's the place where the cancers are, in fact, expanding, growing. And then the third one is progression. That's, you see the redness of the line? I put that there. That's when, in a human sense, that's when the cancer becomes noticeable, being diagnosed. And that's the time when the cancer begins to divide. It's becoming quite dangerous at that point. So that's the timeline, those 3 things there. So we looked at this first stage here, when the mutation is forming, to see what effect the protein diet had on those mechanisms. I'm looking for the mechanism. Because in those days, too, I wanted to find the mechanism, because if we found the mechanism that could account for this, then maybe we can make a drug and block it. That's the foundational philosophy of the entire drug industry. So we're looking for a mechanism. And we found a bunch of things that are going on, one at a time. Each one of these involved a PhD dissertation almost, or more. And so one of the things we learned straight off was that the high protein diet increases the rate at which the carcinogen gets into the cell. That's pretty interesting. We could stop there and say, let's study that in more detail. Let's figure out a way to block the carcinogens from getting into the cell. That's one idea. We found that. And then we looked for another one. By the way, when it gets into the cell, carcinogens, they go into the cell and they get metabolized by an enzyme. What I mean by that, the carcinogen is converted over to a product. A product that's actually more reactive than the parent compound. And so that enzyme that does that is called mixed function oxidase. Any of you heard of the mixed function oxidase? Just curious. Okay, not there. Okay. Anyhow, there's an enzyme there. That's what happens to carcinogens. Most of them, they go in and they get metabolized. They form a product. The product that then is so hot, it's either going to die within nanoseconds, or because of its very extreme chemical reactivity, it's going to bind to something. And what happens, it binds to DNA, among other things. So the carcinogens come in, they get converted, they get the product, it binds to the DNA. DNA is the stuff of genes, as you may know. And that's when it binds to DNA, just to jump ahead a little bit, our bodies have the capability of repairing it, for the most part. 99.999% of it. But a little bit escapes through. If the cell divides before they have a chance to repair it, then now they're stuck there. That's a mutation. So that's what mutation is all about. So that enzyme, MFO, we looked to see what effect did high protein diet do on that with that enzyme. Did 2 things. First, it increased the rate of synthesis of the enzyme. The rate of synthesis, more enzyme, more activity, can happen faster. The other thing it did, there's a big complex enzyme, and it's kind of interesting, but in any case, the high protein diet rearranged things in that enzyme. So what was there became more active. So this is 2 more ways the high protein diet is working to increase the risk. It's increased the rate that comes in the cell, and increase the enzyme in a couple of different ways. We've got 3 possibilities to explain how this high protein diet worked. It also increases the binding of the carcinogen to DNA. Measured that in a separate experiment. This was really the results are fantastic, just sort of a straight line relationship. So the mutation then begins to occur. It's there. And on top of it, and this is what the story became really, really unique and kind of convincing. We have these mechanisms that repair that DNA before the mutation occurs. It's going on all the time. It's happening right now. All of this sitting here, it's happening. Our nature is taking care of things for the most part. The high protein diet compromises that mechanism we have. We got a fail-safe mechanism. Let's call it a fail-safe mechanism. The high protein diet is whacking at that. So it's stimulating all this other stuff. It's going the wrong direction. At the same time, it's knocking down the one mechanism we have for blocking that from going forward. So that's the first stage. So we said, okay, I'm still looking for the mechanism. I don't know where it is. Which one really matters? So we started looking for the second one. The second phase is where the cells are going back and forth. And you notice here, I put here now, reversal, because that's what we saw in the animal studies. We could actually reverse. Very exciting proposition. So we had to take that in consideration as these cells are dividing. And then here's another sort of fail-safe mechanism that the cells have, really beautiful. It's part of the immune system that a lot of people now are aware of in modern day cancer research. The immune system produces lots of cells. As you may know, they attack foreign compounds, they attack viruses, maybe they attack this and that. And so what we learned was that one mechanism, one kind of cell is there ready to go. If a cancer cell forms as a result of mutation, those cells in the immune system are sitting there just waiting. And they go out, produce more to kill them. Naturally, that's the word, natural killer cell activity. That's our immune system. So the immune system is kind of sitting and waiting for any kind of mischief that might arise. Compounds come from the outside, like bacteria, viruses, and cancer cells. So we had a look, and this is the early days of the natural killer cell activity. We did one of the first experiments, and there weren't much going on at the time, but it was a fail-safe mechanism. So high protein diet knocks that down. Now it's killing a second fail-safe mechanism we have. That's really getting pretty impressive now. Then it turns out the high protein increases the rate at which cells divide. That's good for growing kids and pigs and things like that. Cells divide, they multiply. It's not very good for cancer. So it increases cell replication. And then high protein does something else too. It increases so-called oxygen radicals. This is the reactive oxygen species that you may have heard about. These are the kind of chemicals, again, very active. And they're now known, with lots and lots of evidence, they speed up aging. They speed up cancer. They speed up heart disease. They speed up other sorts of things. So the high protein diet is doing that too. It's also increasing a hormone of its own called IGF-1 or IGF-2. There's a couple of different kinds. It increases the production of that, which causes the cells to divide more, thus accounting for that cell replication, if you will. And it changes the calorie intake. Now, I could spend, I could spend 3 or 4 hours on each one of these. I won't. It's just the highlights. Here's the main point from this. When we started looking for a mechanism to explain this unusual, threatening high protein effect, every time we looked for a mechanism, we found one. We looked for 10, as you can see here. Since then, there's been others been considered. All of them were changed in a direction that promotes cancer. 8 of them are increasing the activity that causes the cells to go forward to form cancer. 2 of them were mechanisms we have for protecting ourselves. So knock those out. Just that thought. One nutrient, an important one, albeit, protein, when it acts, it doesn't act on one thing. It's acting on a whole bunch of things. And stop and think about this. When it does that in the natural course of condition or natural course of things, when it does that, all these things are changing, probably simultaneously, and they're all kind of integrated. So now we have a different concept of what nutrients do. Nutrients don't come in and just sort of do one thing, like we teach in our classes. It's coming in and do lots and lots of things. And then all those things tend to work with each other. That's just a function of nature. Okay, so that's another principle that I found really intriguing. That somehow nutrients, they don't come in and act like a drug or just do one thing. They come in and they just do a whole bunch of stuff. It's like a tsunami of mechanisms all traveling together to cause whatever response is going to happen. Now, next question is this. I'm talking about protein very generally. I'm talking about animal protein specifically, of course. The question arises in the average person's mind. which kind of protein should I consume? Do they all do the same thing? Or, how much of this, how much of that? These are very practical questions. So we did a study. In this case, just out of curiosity, we wanted to see, before we had done 5%, 20%, here we just did this. Up to 10%, every one of these is an experiment. So we did up to 10%, no cancers growing even though the mutation had occurred. So we can take up to 10% protein, no problem, even if it's animal protein. And because that is the amount that's needed for other things in our body, we need protein. Okay, so that's going along there. When we go above that, that's when the cancer starts to rise. That's when disease starts to form. So some numbers here that we know about in science. The minimum protein we need is around 5-6%, just to match the protein we normally lose. The amount that's actually recommended dietary allowance, we've known that number since the early 1940s. We need X amount of protein. Fair enough. That is actually the optimum level of protein we should be consuming. A lot of people think in nutrition it's the minimum. It's not. It's the optimum, especially if it were animal protein. So one more thing, even though it's the optimum, the average protein intake that we're consuming in the country was around 16-17%. And about 70% of that, 75% of that protein is from animal sources. We are fundamentally a carnivorous society, except for people sitting in this room, I guess. But basically, we are into protein big time. We consume as much as we can get, and we tend to think, oh, it's coming from animals. Okay, let's eat more animals. That's the idea. So we get up there, and that average amount of, before I get to that point, plants. If we're eating plants, this is really interesting. If we just eat plants to get 10% protein is what we need. All plant diets have enough protein to satisfy our needs. We do not need to get protein from animal sources, period. So the whole crazy idea about protein only comes from animals, that is crazy. Because plants have all the protein we need, and go back to that suggestion of that early studies, the plant protein is not doing the same thing as animal protein. I'll just throw in another observation. Animal proteins increase blood cholesterol for heart disease. Plant proteins don't. Just another thought to sort of show how these things are related. So plants, they do the work for us. They give us all the protein we need. They do a lot of other good things, as you know. Animal food, okay, the way we get up to that average is 16%, we are adding animal food to our diet. That's what we're doing. And so we end up with, as I said, 70-75% of the total protein has come from animals. That's a lot of destruction. That's a lot of destruction. So just to show you what I mean by that, here's a division of nutrients, maybe a division of labor in a sense, for the nutrients of plants and animals. Plants have all the antioxidants. If there's one group of nutrients that is key to our survival almost, it's almost antioxidants, I would suggest. So they're protecting us, a great group of chemicals, complex carbohydrates, vitamins, theoretically all the vitamins produced in plants. There's a couple that's like vitamin A and vitamin D is said to be from animals. No, it's not, because they're mischaracterized. But in any case, plants are doing all these good things, and plants have some fat and protein. They have the right level. We need some fat. So plants are doing everything we need to have done really rather nicely. Animals, they don't have any of this good stuff. Plants, in contrast, have more protein, more fat. That's until one more thought, it has to do with processed foods. In the recent decades, half century or whatever it's been, as we've increased our consumption of processed foods, and I'm thinking about, there's another word I like for that called convenience foods. Cakes and puddings and all that sort of stuff. Those kind of products are made up of parts of plants, maybe in some cases parts of whatever. They're made up of nutrients. They're sweet, rich in sugar, rich in fat, isolated fat from someplace else. So those kind of foods are not exactly to they don't serve our purposes. If anything, they're highly varied, of course, and they're hard to study in some ways, but they don't do as good. They're certainly not whole plants like here. So now I'm going to show you another wrinkle of this that just really brought this whole story home to me in terms of real life nutrition. This, for example, is a chart in 1975. You can see right there, Ken Carroll, a friend of mine from University of Western Ontario in Canada, did a lot of great work. He actually went out and sort of got information on how much nutrition is each country consuming, or nutrients, I should say, how much nutrients, and then comparing it with things like heart disease and cancer and stuff like that. And right here is one plot, 1975, he did that the first time. All these different countries. That's pretty impressive. And he characterized it as an effect of fat, because that's what people tended to think. It was all about fat that caused the problem. They didn't talk about protein in those days. He was the only one talking about it a little bit, but in this chart, he's shown fat, increased fat. That looks impressive. Here's where we are up here near the top. Well, he published two more, and that was actually so much told around the country, especially in medical and scientific circles in those days. I often said in my college that that was the most shown graph ever, at least in biology and medicine. A lot of people knew about that, because a similar chart like that existed for heart disease. This is breast cancer, and those two observations, increased fat, more heart disease, more cancer. That's why everybody in the public heard about that. Got to get down to low fat, because it's all about fat. Well, Ken Carroll didn't quite get it right. And I say that with all due deference to Dr. Carroll, because I presented this at the National Academy of Science when he was on a committee. And I told him, I was invited to comment, I told him I wanted to reinterpret his data, and he was all for it. So I do have his consensus on that. Here's what I'm talking about. That's total fat. That's total fat. Because this chart, here's another chart that people don't talk about. He took the plant fat for all these different countries. No relationship. So it looks like the plant fat's not doing anything, right? And he did the animal fat, saturated fat at that, unsaturated fat is in plants, saturated fat is in animals. He took the saturated fat, and there, it turns out the saturated fat is highly correlated with protein, animal protein. This is not a fat effect for a variety of reasons. This could have been just as easily animal protein, because the line there is like that. And think of it that way. As soon as animal protein is put into the diet, we start to see some risk to breast cancer arising. And the fact that it goes right through this origin here, that's a big deal. Because in theory, it says as soon as we start putting animal protein in the diet, we might expect to begin to see some problems, especially for people who are more sensitive to that kind of effect. So it's not the fat versus cancer or fat versus heart disease, it's the animal protein versus that. For me, that was a big awareness, because what that says, and this is lifetime experience, was that even though you can see these effects early on, we want to know what happens over a lifetime. Look over a lifetime, there it is. No one will ever show the opposite. That's a one-time kind of observation. It's done. It's fact. That's it. High animal protein diets are going to be associated with that. And then I just grabbed out of the literature at one point a bunch of slides like this, graphs like this, that other researchers had called something different. And they're all related to animal protein. And I'm going to show them quickly. There's animal protein versus breast cancer deaths. I just showed you that. Animal protein versus the incidence of cancer, when they get diagnosed, same thing. Uterine cancer, animal protein, as soon as that goes up, that's really pretty impressive. See, the different people called it different things. They called it meat intake, or what's that up there? Fat intake, total fat. There's one for colon cancer. See how the line goes through the zero? For any of you familiar with correlations and scatter plots and stuff, this sort of stuff, I think you'll recognize the significance of that. There's something about that, whatever that line represents. I'm saying it represents animal protein and all the things that come along with the consumption of animal protein. So you got that, you got this. That's kidney cancer, prostate cancer. Prostate cancer, that's really was published as the relationship between skim milk and prostate cancer. Skim milk is a risk factor for prostate cancer. Very powerful. What is skim milk? It's a protein drink. Because you take out the fat, what's left over is protein. So it's an animal protein drink, essentially. You see that. Here it is cholesterol, which in turn is determined by animal protein. I can't get into that right here. But that's coronary heart disease versus cholesterol intake, which is a function of protein. Another one, here's mortality. This researcher here published in 1959, and he said, with percent protein, he was one of them to dare to say that this kind of information was really about protein, not about fat. So that's the larger story here. All the stuff you've tended to hear about fat being related to this and that, animal fat in particular, not really true. It's the animal protein that really matters and what it brings along with it that causes the problem. So now I want to tell you this little story. That being said, what I've just said, I'm sorry to get into so much detail, but I had to show that because each of these are, they're really kind of significant in terms of the effect of the size, effect size, if you will, in terms of the mechanism that go with it. So recently, in 2002, we had yet another publication of the dietary guidelines. How many know about dietary guidelines? Well, you know, that's sort of one of the principal ways by which the public gets to know what the science is thinking about, let's say, recommendations on nutrition. In any case, the dietary guidelines is run from the USDA, the livestock sector. They are preceded, as far as science is concerned, by the Food and Nutrition Board of the National Academy of Science. Food and Nutrition Board, they determine every 5 years how much of individual nutrients we need. That information is transported over here to the Dietary Guidelines Committee, and they turn it into food. They make My Plate, they make pyramids, they make these kind of things. So they're turning scientific information into practical information. Now, what I'm showing you here is something that happened at the level of the Food and Nutrition Board. That's key. They decided in 2002. These kind of records came up every 5 years. And the initial one was in 1943. National Academy of Science, they determined how much of each nutrient we need. They published the recommended dietary allowances that you hear about. And they put some new wrinkles into this in 2002. They wanted to tell what's the maximum safe level of different nutrients, not just the amount they're recommended. They said, let's talk about what does the science show in terms of maximum safe level. That's what they did. So they established that. I'm going to show you the one for protein. This is the range of protein intake as a percent of calories. There's the minimum amount we need. I showed that before. That 9%, that's the amount that's recommended. That's where the RDA is, right about there. Okay, let me move on here. Minimum. That's the RDA. That's what we've been living with. That's what science suggests. Nobody's really disputing that. 9%, 8, 9, 10% total protein is really ideal. Total protein. Our range of protein intake, as I said before, is between about 11 and 20 through 23. Here's the Atkinites and keto people up here. Anyhow, there's the range of intake, and our average is around, as I said before, around 17, 18%. We're pretty high. We only need this, we eat that. And even the least of us still get this much protein. We all get enough protein. And as I said, most of it's animal-based, okay? When we exceed 10% protein, here's the way it works. When we exceed about 10% protein, if it's coming from animal foods, we're asking for trouble. You saw from that other slide. We're getting into the danger zone. So I would say that, first off, animal protein need not be consumed because we don't need it. But the plant protein we're consuming, that by the way, can be as high as we like. Because that's in whole food, and when you consume protein in that form, first off, it has less activity. But in addition, when it's being consumed as whole food, you get all these antioxidants, and it's all coming together. So you can eat as much plant protein as you like. We don't need animal protein. That's where you get in trouble. So what's this new wrinkle putting this cap on? There's our average, okay? Upper safe limit, 35%. Just imagine that. How could this body, this august highly respected, so-called very scientific society establish a number like that. That's ridiculous. That's ridiculous, because what that does, if they're telling the public, and that's what's done, they tell that to the school lunch programs. They tell that to all the policy groups and so forth. When you say that out there in the public, and various government programs are established on the basis that we can consume up to 35% protein, what that says, eat as much protein as you like. All safe. Good. So that 35% figure is illegitimate. It's simply false. It's a representation of something that should not exist. The chairman of that committee that first established that, the director of the Food and Nutrition Board at that time, was the same man who was the chairman of the Department of Nutrition here at Cornell. He was my supervisor. He didn't particularly care for my views, I can say that for sure. But anyhow, was in a very august position. That board establishes 35% protein. I say that is the most egregious, annoying, wrongful act in the history of nutritional science. Because now that number is out there, dietitians are using it, everybody's sort of assuming it for those who actually think about it. But even if they don't think about it, there's programs around, rounded out around that point. And it gives some justification for our using as much protein as we like. And so it turned out that that's what it is, up to 35%. He, in turn, at the same time, was director of the Dietary Guidelines Committee. So his group over here are creating the number, passing it over to this group who makes the dietary guidelines, and he's head of that too. This is now fixed in place. So dietitians around the country tended to believe, and most everybody else who think about this, 35% okay. Not true. That's a totally false thing. He also is the one who, I know I'm treading on some sensitive territory here, but he's chairman of the Department of Nutritional Science. He's the one who took my course out of the catalog without my knowing it. That's why now I'm here doing some other things. It's just something to think about. I say that what we should be advising is the whole food plant-based proteins. That plant-based diet has all the protein we need. Maybe more the better, but it's not doing anything if we're using whole food. It's what it is. So let me move on here about the size of this problem, the importance of this problem. Because remember I said nutrition renaissance? I'm talking about a new way to think about nutrition that has major, major implications. Here, I'm summarizing some diseases for which there is evidence in the scientific literature to support this. That chart was put together when in 2002 and 2003, I was working with my son, writing the book, and coming to the realization that our recommendations for whether it's heart disease or cancer or osteoporosis or whatever, it seemed like this effect was having a very broad common denominator, was affecting lots of different diseases. So we looked in the literature to see if there was any evidence from past years that maybe some of this evidence existed and was ignored. Well, here's the evidence. All these diseases here, there was published information in the scientific literature that they all are affected the same way. Different mechanisms, of course, different pathologies, obviously, different this, different that. But in reality, the whole food plant-based diet has a tendency to decrease and actually even reverse these diseases if we have them. Brings up a whole new sort of point for discussion. So the effect is broad, and that's something that I really want to emphasize. This kind of diet, the kind of nutrition it produces, is exceptionally broad. That opens up a whole new world of thinking. It's not about what one nutrient does to one thing, which we all live on, with RDAs and labels on food cans and stuff like that. This is a very broad effect. So we take that stance that way, we can possibly see lots of benefits. And we do now when we see it. It's very fast. We can see changes for those people who wish to change. I say from what I used to eat, some of you may have done so. If you, in fact, change over to a whole food plant-based diet, don't come back and dump a lot of oil and sugar on it, but if you do that, the results we see are within a week, 2 weeks. Serum cholesterol goes like that, down 50 to 100 points on average. People with pain, some of the pain begins to resolve. Diseases begin to correct themselves. It's really quite amazing. This is not about just preventing. It's not about thinking out in the future, okay, if I eat this way, I won't get that. It's about right now, the here and now. If you've got a problem, just try it. That's what we said in the China study. I'd come to this sort of impression, I didn't want to be too certain about this, but in reality, I've given, 900 lectures at least since our book came out, a lot of them to medical schools. And what I'm finding, let's make a side story here, I've spoken to probably a couple hundred medical schools, doctors and obviously in training and faculties and stuff like this, either medical schools or medical conferences, medically supported conferences. At first when I was doing this, now 7 or 8 years ago I guess, I was daring to go to medical school and telling them, hey, you've not been trained in this area, here's what we see. I was getting kind of silence from these audiences. I think they were kind of stunned or something. Of course, they hadn't been trained in this topic. You think I'm a little bit crazy. I was thinking, too, that I wasn't being very effective. A little discouraged for a year or two. And all of a sudden, I happened to see more interest being shown. And the first kind of sort of behavioral response I got was anger. Doctors going to medical school, not being trained in this area, and then asking why. Why wasn't I taught this? And so eventually, then in the last 5 years, I guess, I've spoken to medical conferences, upwards of 900,000 physicians. I get a standing ovation when I'm introduced. It's happened several times instead of when I tell them the story. So it's catching on. It's catching on in the medical community, at least those who choose to come to these kind of conferences. Maybe they're special kinds of people, wanted to hear this. But in any case, I want to make it a little departure because the medical system is the one that needs to hear this. They need to hear this for the sake of the public at large, as well as for their own good. So if the dietary change is sustained, this is not a drug. You don't do this for a couple of weeks to get rid of a problem or a month or something like this. You do this, get used to it, enjoy it, keep going, because that's the way it works. So now we got a new idea here. We tend to think of nutrition preventing things in the future. I'm talking about the evidence that now shows we can see it actually treats conditions in existence now. That is the future discussion about this nutrition effect. It's not about disease prevention. It's about treatment. People want to know now when they have problems, what they can do about it. So that's a very broad effect. Beta carotene, looking at single nutrients, and this you don't take a single nutrient out of food, even if you think it's really good. You don't take it out and put it in a pill and try to do it that way. It doesn't work. You might see some effects in some cases a little bit for short term, but what I'm saying here, on the basis of this study in particular, this is sort of the first one that started up. They did a study to see what effect beta carotene. Beta carotene is the pre-vitamin A. It's an antioxidant in plants. And so it stops all these reactive oxygen species that causes lung cancer from smoking. So they said, let's do this study. Let's get a bunch of smokers who are destined to get lung cancer at a certain rate. Let's give one group a pill, beta carotene. That looks like pretty good because smokers who have beta carotene in their blood, those who have the most beta carotene in their blood from the food, the lung cancer rate is really down. It's almost down to zero if it's high enough. It's very dramatic. So they decided to take the pill, the beta carotene out of it and put in a pill, see what happened. Here's the results they got. 29,000 smokers. Following them for what they hoped would be 8 years. They had to quit early. The beta carotene in the food was associated with a decrease in lung cancer rates. Not just because of beta carotene, I assure you. There was other things going on, but that's what really turned out to be the case. It was significant. The supplement beta carotene actually increased lung cancer. That's what supplements generally are now being shown to do. We got lots of studies showing that. You take the nutrient out of the food, instead of eating the food, you think you're going to accomplish what you want to accomplish. And we see a lot of evidence now that these supplements, they act differently when they're in isolation. They can have the opposite effect, either no effect or they have an opposite effect. There's now a few hundreds of these kinds of studies. They've been summarized. That's the nature of it. The public's not listening, though, because they're still spending $50 billion a year in this country, people taking supplements, thinking that they're getting a good nutrition. That's not nutrition, that's pharmacology. So I want to make that distinction. Nutrition is about whole food. It's not about pills and procedures. So now that gets me into this territory I want to define as a new way to think about nutrition. Namely, let me start out with this and show you the complexities of nutrient action in the body. I'm going to show you here the pathway. How a nutrient, when you consume it, you know how much we can know how much we consume. Now I'm going to trace it through the body and decide what happens to it. We know how much is here. We eat it according to some recommendations. The food comes in and gets digested. That means released from the food, just put in intestinal contents. Then it's absorbed, and then it's transported through the blood. And then after that, it crosses the barrier and goes into the cells, and then it acts inside of the cell. That's an infinitely complex system. See all these things going on? That's what happens to a nutrient. I mean, in theory, that's the scheme. But here's the thing I want to say about that, because we have good science on this point. That is, the body adjusts the amount, let's say, being digested by upwards of 20%. It does it within nanoseconds of time. It does it with different conditions. And so it's true for all those. So once you realize this, and there's science to justify this statement, once you realize of this, there's no way we can tell how much nutrient we're consuming is actually acting up at the functional site. So the amount of nutrient we consume, be it from a pill or whatever, really has almost nothing to do with the amount of the functional site. There's something else going on here. It really has to do with the ability of the body to adjust these things at each stage. And so when it's going through all these phases, the body is acting in really, we could say, almost mysterious ways. It's always adjusting things. And then it directs it to go, some go here, some go there. It's a marvelous concept, but that's real nutrition. It's not about this very sort of arithmetic, knowing how much is here, how much is there, what it does here, and so forth. That's the wrong way to look at it, really. I just showed you that in theory for one nutrient. Whatever we might have been able to learn for that one nutrient, if we could, we can't, but let's say we could. If we did it for one nutrient, it'll all change in the next nanosecond when there's another nutrient in there. Everything changes. So what we're talking about here, what I'm talking about, is a dynamic system beyond comprehension. We can't know the details. The body is deciding, and nature is deciding, let's say. The nature is deciding how much of the nutrient here, there, whatever, what combination. The nature is deciding what to do with the nutrient. And the complexity of that action is broad, is fast. That's nutrition. And so there's a cell, if you've all seen that or heard of that. That's the basic unit of biology. Each cell is like a whole universe. It's that complex. And there's everything going on inside of it. There's where the business is. Somewhere's that number in our bodies. We can't know. Anyhow, there it is. Each cell, not visible, easily sits on the head of a pin. Can't see it. We got that many cells in our body, and they talk to each other. At the same time, they're talking to each other. It's like a micro-universe. We know there's some science, we've got evidence that they communicate with each other. What one group of cells chooses to do has an influence on another group of cells that might choose something the same or whatever. They work together. They work through hormones, they work through nerve function and so forth. So the whole system of nutrition is so dynamic. That's the beauty of this subject. It is so beautiful. It is a representation of nature. It is nature. And that's who we are. I think we've forgotten through the eons of time that we are also nature. We're always trying to tease things out and then mechanically organize it in such a way that we want to do what we think we're doing, when in fact we're not paying attention to what nature's already doing for us. Another way to show this. How many of you have seen this Krebs cycle? Some hands? I'm just trying to judge a little bit about, I mean, it's coming from the scientific arena. That's it. Right here, this is what happens to chemicals. The first chemicals formed from sunlight, solar energy, sunlight, is a carbohydrate. This right here says glucose. And then it breaks down, as many of you know, through different stages, different reactions. And all this process here is breaking it down one reaction at a time, peeling off some energy. The sunlight, the energy from the sunlight is put into the bonds, the chemical bonds of the compound formed. So it's being converted from a solar energy to a mechanical energy, chemical energy. And now it's all stacked up. This is loaded up with energy. And that's what this metabolism is. It's an opportunity for the body to kind of come along, peel off that energy package and send them someplace. Anyway, that's what I taught. Right, that's what I taught in the beginning of my career. Very exciting, and even simpler than that. I liked it. It was very exciting to learn each reaction, each enzyme, and all that sort of stuff. Some years later, it turned into that. Now it's worse. That's metabolism. There's so many reactions here, and people will spend their whole careers just working on that reaction right there. Maybe. That's science. That's biochemistry. That's the way we do things. So let me say something about that. Being aware of that picture, what does that mean? The drug protocol. Here's what the drug industry is all about. Their assumption is that if we can go in, as I tried to do with a protein, if we can go in and find the reaction that is key to the endpoint, we can make a drug, right? We now know that 85% of the drugs that are made don't work when you put them on the market. Most of them a lot of them just sort of disappear because of a lot of side effects. So we make drugs all the time with this presumption that we can go and pick up one thing and create a chemical, not a nutrient, by the way, some other foreign chemical, makes it even worse, that we can pick up one thing that's going to do the job for us and then solve our illness. I don't mean to say that some drugs don't work, they do. We can find some that there is evidence that they certainly do, and maybe in some cases major. But it's not the general theme of how to create health. That's the drug protocol, trying to find one reaction there. Make a chemical come in, traverse, navigate through that forest. And by the way, all drugs have side effects. And then they don't work at the end of the day for a lot of them. So the whole hypothesis, the whole presumption of the drug industry, it really should be seriously questioned. Because the idea is, if you take drugs, you're going to solve some illness, whatever. And we're not trying to navigate that very complex system. It doesn't quite work that way. So finding specific causes and treatments is the basis. Okay, I said that. Now let me come back and just show you, illustrate something about one case, one example. Somebody, some years ago, in the 1980s it was, or late 70s I guess it was, they were aware that high cholesterol in the blood is associated with more heart disease, right? So the general consensus, well, let's get that cholesterol down. Let's knock that down. If we can knock that cholesterol down, we won't get heart disease. That's sort of the general theme that was out there. So they found out that cholesterol is synthesized in our bodies. We make cholesterol, we need it to some extent. So they find out that it starts with this compound here, acetyl-CoA, goes through a series of reactions. This is normal biology, normal biochemistry. We make cholesterol. So the idea is, late 80s, early 90s, let's find something to knock that thing down, and we can maybe won't get heart disease. So that was it, and they found one particular reaction along that pathway that seemed to be rate limiting, as they said. And they found a drug to block that reaction. And they called it statins. This became the $80 to $90 billion industry, using statins to reduce heart disease. Do statins really reduce heart disease? It's variable. I've seen a number of studies. I've talked to some of the ones who really have studied it fairly carefully. Some studies say absolutely not. Some studies will allow for the fact that, yes, it's down by 10%, 15%. I don't know where it is. So you find different numbers for different things, but it's very minimal. But the main point is going on that regimen. This is what people with heart disease do. They go on statins, and then they keep getting pains every once in a while, so they have to have a stent put in. So most people with heart disease, emerging heart disease, they go through a regimen of using statins for their lifetime, patching things up with a stent from time to time. That's it. You add up the cost of the statins and the stents. It's in excess, easily, of $20,000 a year. Somebody's paying for it. Maybe not the individual, of course, in most cases, but somebody's paying for it. The society's paying for it. It's probably closer now to $30,000 a year, one person, to maintain so-called health that doesn't look like it's really working that well. And so they take the statins. They have side effects. A lot of people quit because of the side effects, the pains and so forth. That's a drug protocol. That's the solution. That's the solution of the system for treating heart disease. Mammoth. And everybody sort of does it, accepts it. Many people believe it. It's not really what it could be. I'm going to argue that based on, especially my friend Dr. Esselstyn, who many of whom you know is a surgeon at Cleveland Clinic, he took a group of people, gave them a whole food plant-based diet, and watched them. And the early study was published. I'm going to show you the most recent. He took a bunch of people with heart disease, confirmed the baseline. They sit them down for 5 hours, told them some stuff, how to cook and how to eat and that sort of thing. 2 to 7 years later, picks up the phone, calls them, and said, "You still doing what I told you to do?" And someone, 89%, yeah, we're doing it. These are people with heart patients. Yeah, we're still doing that. Well, how are you doing? Have any of you had an event, another occasion to have a heart disease? And so out of the 177, or out of the 196 he called that he had treated, 177, yeah, we're doing it. I'm feeling pretty good about it. 89%, that's pretty good compliance rate. And then it asked them this, as I said, have you had another event? The people who did it during that period of time, only one person out of the 177 had an event. That person actually died. It was a friend of mine. I said to Dr. Esselstyn. I heard from his wife later that he really wasn't compliant. But anyhow, be that as it may, one person, had an event out of the 177. Of those who did not comply, they all kept getting heart attacks, or some dying. It was a 67%. They said, that number's too high. I think it's a quirk. It's more like 30% or something of that sort. But in any case, big difference. So let's take what he did, what Ornish did, what some other did before that back in the 1950s, found that diet can work really like this, put it together. Oh wait, before I get to that. Cancer treatment. It's another model, just working with cancer. Cancer, big disease. Heart disease, cancer, 1, 2 in the country. So here's on cancer treatment. Just, I'm skipping over too much stuff here, but these are the highlights. On cancer treatment, the average cost of developing a new cytotoxic chemotherapy agent, according to a major study between the United States and Australian scientists, according to their big collection of data on cancer patients from 1970 onwards, they just simply analyzed for those patients, comprised of 22 different kinds of cancer. He asked the question, how much is it costing for that? And does it work? That's the real cost. There's what they call it, if the investment has been made for other things, there's $2.5 billion of drug. $2.5 billion of drug to make a cytotoxic agent. So wow, $2.5 billion, those drugs don't even must be working. Here's what they found out was not true. When they compared the 5-year survival rates of these cancer patients, all those people taking all those drugs, mammoth numbers of people, increase in 5-year survival rates only 2.1%. That's nothing. It's nothing. The track record for cytotoxic chemotherapy agents is poor. There's a couple of cancers where you see something like that's looking interesting, probably significant for a bit, but basically it doesn't really work like what they think it does. So I come back to this chart. So that's the drug protocol. I'm saying the nutrition protocol is where it should be. Because when we're eating food, you got all this stuff all working together. Multiple reactions, no side effects. It's exactly the opposite. Just to finish off. So I'm talking about something that a lot of people want to say, oh, that's vegan, or that's vegetarian. No, it's not. I did the research. I was not involved in this whatsoever to promote any of those diets. And so I just want to show you why that is a question of interest. Vegans, you saw that 90% of the vegetarians use that. Vegans use all sorts of things here. Here's the proof of the pudding. Here's the amount of nutrients in this is the biggest study of comparison of vegans, vegetarians, and meat eaters out of the European EPIC study, in case you might know that. But in any case, notice here, the fat intake on all three is the same. Vegans make a good choice, an ethical choice for not eating animals. That's fair enough, that's a good idea. But then they don't pay attention to the science. And what they do is they substitute a lot of fat and sugar for what they otherwise had been eating. So they end up with these two nutrients in particular. The fat is the same, and the sugar is the same. The whole food plant-based diet, which I'm defining over here, that's just a judgment call. I'm saying that the ideal diet should have around 10% fat, 10% or so sugar, if you like. It varies, but that's sort of like a target. So the vegan vegetarian diets, I very much respect the motivation for that. That's not the issue. I support it. But that's not, the real issue is, let's look at the science. Let's see what it can do. That argument just for the vegan diets, use that as an argument for health is not going to get us any place. It's going to actually stymie the progress in this field. So I'm going to finish up here just telling you this is what I call holistic nutrition. It's a highly interactive, integrative holicism minus the cult of animal protein. I've just finished doing, with my grandson, I've done a study started 30 years ago, looking at the history of this whole field. Why did we ever, what's in our history that might tell us something about how we got in such a mess? A lot of it has to do with protein. A lot of it has to do with our choice to consume animal protein. And so that's why I say it became a cult, in my view. And I mean that in a broad sense as well as some depth. You can argue that case in many different ways, from the cultural notions that we had through the years, as well as, in fact, the science, if you like, as well as, in fact, the policy that was formed. So nutritional science, I'm going to argue, is exceptionally impactful. Properly taught is revolutionary. And there's not a university in the United States that teaches this, not one, including here at Cornell. Nutrition is not taught in this manner. I mean, I know because I was the one doing a lot of the teaching. The upper class nutritional biochemistry course, as well as some of the lower courses in biochemistry. I know what we did. I know what I did. I know what others do. I know what others are still doing. Yet the department, the discipline, the program, whatever you want to call it, in various universities, they're not embracing this idea. When in fact, nutritional science, if it's done right, and people use it and they're told this, the solutions we can solve are enormous. And so medical schools don't teach nutrition. I mean, really, I'm talking about something very, very serious. Here's medicine. The whole operation of medicine is reductionist. We're trying to find a cause and a mechanism, and here's a drug, and that kind of thing. And so that's what that is. Lots of side effects. We don't make a whole lot of progress. Not in medicine. We're not really creating much health. This is why holistic nutrition is not taught in medical schools. Medical schools are operating on the reductionist philosophy. They don't seem to understand. They have actually, for the last 100 years, shut out nutrition from their program. And people wonder why doctors are not taught nutrition. They don't understand it. They have no concept. In fact, the entire enterprise of operating with medicines as a solution to health is faulty. That's not the way nature planned it. Nature had it such that we eat food, whole food. We can eat more or less what we want, as long as it's minus the inclusion of animal protein, if you will. So it's not taught, and there's about 130 medical specialties in this country used by Medicare programs and stuff like that. that's the kind of, these specialties is the thing that sort of triggers reimbursement. There's about 130 medical specialties. And the doctor diagnoses a patient, writes that number down, gets reimbursed according to that number. Of the 130, not one is labeled nutrition. Think about that in historical context. Think about not only the historical context, how did that happen? But think about what it is doing to our society now. Nutrition is kind of off the chart. You know, they don't, and doctors want to make complaints. I have to say this carefully because I happen to have that experience. Now seeing lots of doctors all of a sudden begin to embrace the idea. But they weren't taught, and then they got angry because they found out they weren't taught. So I'm just simply saying, here is the major premier biological science of all time. It's a return to nature. It's the real thing. Here's how we get healthy. Here's how we get healthy. And we can treat ourselves doing this. But in reality, this is not what we're being told. It's kind of a big secret. And instead, we teach them nutrition like I did. Here's the chemical, here's the nutrient here, and it does this and that. No, that's okay stuff, you know, for foundation, but it's not the end game. It's not the message that we want to talk about. Okay, so I already said that. I turned it into a book, as many of you may know, and I did it with my youngest son, Tom, who's now the medical director of a major program at the University of Rochester Medical Center. So he's now taken up some of these kind of things that I would have gotten into. It's kind of exciting. But in any case, we did that. And I didn't know where it was going when it came out. I knew I was off the chart a little bit. And said, you know, I think one place I said in the book, you know, try it. Don't pay attention to what I'm saying, just try it. Well, it turned out the lesson I got back has been enormous. The number of people who have actually trying it and getting the results is staggering. And really spectacular results. Just trying it, recovering their health. And now it's been translated, and this actually now is a record. It's over 47 foreign languages. Dr. Spock held the record before that. He had 42. So the book has really gotten out there, I must tell you. It's really going around the world. And so the message is getting out there. Really, that's a good sign. But at the same time, we have institutions, and that includes academia, government, industry. We have institutions that find their insidious ways to be able to stymie this message. It's something that I think everybody should be thinking about. It's much larger than just your own personal health. That book came along and that describes more in detail, as many of you may know, the biochemistry, the philosophy, if you will, the scientific philosophy that is backing up what I'm saying here. One of the reasons this is happening now is really key. It has to do with what I call academic freedom. Academic freedom. There's a chart put together, not my chart. These are others who measured this. From 1971, I think it was, when it first started, until about 2010 or 12. They tracked how many faculty are actually on tenure-track positions in universities across this land. When I was a graduate student here at Cornell, I thought most of the professors were like 90% on tenure-track positions. I think it was probably true. Almost everybody had the opportunity of, you know, being reviewed to be on a tenure-track position and having academic freedom to say what they want to say. That's the way it was. That's what we all thought, to the extent we even thought about it. But finally, in 1970 or so, somebody started tracking it. And then they got some more data. I think it was 2012. I forget the exact number. And tenure is the green bars, and the other purple or whatever is otherwise. Tenure, academic tenure is going down. Now, today, I would bet that not more than about 10% of the faculty really have academic freedom. Actually, it's 9% who have the freedom, have all their positions in place. They can speak the truth. And the reason that we're not able to tell what I tend to talk about, because if we're on hire, if we don't have tenure, let's say we're hired for 5 years, if we don't say the things, if we start saying things like I'm saying, out of here, So faculty, at least in this area of work, are on hire. It's contractual. And so the information not taught, now like I like to talk about it, where I think the really big story is, and I think it's a very serious question. And so that's one of my main points of telling this, because I've lived it. I've seen it. I've seen the decline. It's because it dropped in academic tenure. And there were some individuals at the Supreme Court level in 1970, friends of Nixon, who started this at the time. And it's been going down ever since. So faculty are not getting the opportunity to speak freely what we think. We just have to kind of abide by the written and unwritten rules of the day. Tenure track is going up. This, I just put it here quickly, I think many of you know, the course I had, it was canceled actually, is now online on a nonprofit center. We're now joined with the online program at Cornell. Thank goodness, it's very nice. We've had good success with that. Very proud about it. We got now another course coming along. It's called Plant-Based Nutrition. You take it, and you can look more into it that way if you're interested. I'm now aware that what I'm talking about has very, very far-reaching dimensions that some people would label as disruptive technology for major industries. I mean, there's the cancer industry. It does not need to exist the way it is. We need to be able to do the kind of research that should be done, should have been done in the past. I don't know what we're going to see with it, but we got some going now. My son at the University of Rochester is doing that, getting some funding from our center, by the way, I should say. So there's cancer industry that needs to be questioned. There's big time needs to be questioned. The basic mantra of the entire drug industry is to talk about targeted drug therapy. You may have heard the term. Or precision medicine, same thing. You know, somehow we're going to find out the very little details that's going to work for you and you and you. May be different, but we're going to find it out and then have a cocktail, you know, to treat things. And that lastly, the livestock industry, where I came from. Now, I know this information, I'm not suggesting that, by no means am I even anticipating that everybody will do this. This is not just simply not true. It's not my business to tell anybody what to do. I just accept whatever people do. I would only say one thing. This information should be known. And the US government, hand in hand with industry, I should say, I've been on policy committees for many years, US government in the hands of the industry, who tend to like them, working together, are controlling the information. You can bet your bottom dollar they're controlling the information to protect these industries. That's really what it comes down to. And also, in order to get change, I've been asked that, how do you get change? I'm not really sure. I think education is one thing, just making information available. But when we're told we can't say this information, I've raised my hand. Wait a minute, that's not true. That is not the way to go. People have to learn about this. It's their choice. If they choose not to do it, fine, that's dandy. But at least they should be offered the information that really counts. And I'm saying, here's an opportunity for nutrition. If only we knew, people really knew what nutrition could do. That's the information I'm talking about. Then we can take a step forward and see what else does this mean. What does knowing this information mean? Oh, it means personal health. That's one thing for sure. There's some other things. This is my last slide. This is just an array of some ideas. Healthcare costs in this country are the highest per capita of any country in the world, by far, because people living on drugs. That's costly. If somehow some number of people started using this here approach here, drug costs would plummet. They just need to know, need to be told. So healthcare costs are a big deal. Unnecessary violence, we know all about that. Violence to all sorts of things. Living, loss of species. Violence to other sentient beings, whatever we want to call it. It's all part of the same game. Right there is a big problem, personal health compromise. I saved one of the biggest for the moment to last. This is the one that I think either we have to learn how to do this, we have to talk about doing this, or we're going to pay a price right there. And so That, I think many of you know, that's a big issue. It's now with us, and it turns out the first modern day statement on this point was made by the World Bank. I was involved because I was invited to come along and give a lecture. This is the 1990s. And the senior advisor on the environment wanted to know. He got very excited about these. He published papers, made an estimate with his colleague that more than 50% of all the global warming, climate change in the country, this is, when was it? 15 years ago now. Global warming, 50% or more is due to the food we eat, livestock. Now that's being supported by a number of other institutions, not the 51%. Some yes, some no, but at least the United Nations have said that this is the agency of the United Nations that actually promotes livestock. They have said that the #1 cause of climate change is livestock production. So people are coming on board, and we hear now daily about the evidence that actually is now with us. Tipping point. Are we near the tipping point, or we've passed it? I mean, this is urgent. And so just changing what we choose to eat, just changing what we need to choose to eat. And if we know this information, we get it in our heads, know how this really works, try it, I think change can happen. So I got one more book coming out. I'm telling verse and chapter. It's already been written, essentially, of my own experience in this over the past 60 years. I'm naming names, naming places, naming things, because I know it's treacherous a little bit to be that specific, but I've been there. I think I've been there more than anyone in the sense of being in the lab, doing the research, being in the policy committee. I've been on a number of those policy boards. I know how science gets translated to the public. I've seen it all. And I think at some point, we need to stand up and be clear, about what we've seen. That's some of the possible titles, so want to vote for what you think is good. Some of it like Nutrition Renaissance, Nutrition Justice for All, or is there injustice for all? I'm not sure. So I'm going to argue that nutrition is a science. That's what should be taught here at Cornell and other universities across the country. Let students decide for themselves what they want to hear. Thank you. Thank you. I hope we might have, I'm told, maybe a few questions. I don't know. Chloe, where did you go?
Yeah, we can do a Q&A.
Do we have some time?
We have a mic.
Pardon?
We have a mic for Q&A, so just raise your hand.
Okay, just raise your hand. Shout out real loud so I can hear. Yeah, Jonathan. Jonathan. Oh, he got it. Great, fantastic, Leslie. Isabel.
Thanks very much, Colin. It strikes me that if one was to teach nutrition differently, one would have to teach all the other biological disciplines differently too, right? The genetics would be different, the molecular biology would be different, the physiology would be different. Everything about biology would basically be different. And, I'd like to see that happen. I think it should happen, scientifically speaking. But, I think your analysis could do with thinking about the relationship between those different disciplines a little bit. And maybe you do in your book. I'm not quite sure.
Well, thank you. I can make a comment. The gentleman who was speaking here runs a really beautiful online newspaper. The title is Independent
Science News. Independent Science News.
Independent Science News.
Thanks,
Beautiful.
Colin.
Just take a look at it on the web.
Thank you for spreading the message to this audience. At the risk of making this appear like a tent revival, I wanted to say that 3 or 4 years ago I was diagnosed with rheumatoid arthritis. My smart wife was aware of your message, and we've been maintaining a whole food plant-based diet, and my arthritis is effectively gone. It doesn't trouble me at all, so thank you very much. The observation I make here out of today's seminar is that both your books make a strong case that big business funding research is a crux of the problem too, in addition to the tenure issue that you brought up.
Yeah, I mean, you would think, if in a fair society or open society, the amount of money that's concentrated in the corporate sector. Oh, maybe it's run out of batteries or something. Yeah, maybe I can talk in this thing here. Okay, I guess you can hear me, right? Better? Anybody can't hear me? Okay, good. Yeah, back to your question. Yeah, I've heard many stories, like testimonials, if you will, which is encouraging. I mean, people really do, when they discover that they do what they do and they get resolve their problems, in many cases very serious problems, it's just heartwarming to see that kind of thing. And as far as going back to, you know, the book that we're doing, it's not a book for testimonials. I haven't gone quite that far, you know, involved in that, but it's a powerful message form. I think going, Jonathan, back to your comment, yeah, these different disciplines, sub-disciplines, if you will, or whatever we want to call them, they are related. We're talking about a big message here. It goes all the way to the guy who says, I'm going to make America great again. Well, I don't care for him. But in any case, I think we are at a point in time when, yeah, we have to start talking about the interrelationship of things one with another. We know they exist. And most of us want to do that. I mean, I think the vast majority of people are aware of that and want to do it. We just have to figure out how to get out of our silos and, you know, start doing that. Yeah. You had another part of the question. I forgot what it was.
Big business is funding research?
Oh, yeah, that's right. Yeah, you would think the big business should be funding research, and they do fund a lot of research, I must tell you, but not the kind I'm talking about. They're funding research to develop yet another product that they can make some money on. All understood. Understand that system. We are in a free society. We do operate on the free enterprise system. I'm not against that. I'm not talking about at that level at all. I'm just saying that I think the best way to keep that system at the same time for it to be fair and open is information, knowledge. Let people know, and the system will kind of begin to sort out itself. You know, it's where it goes. So I'm all for knowledge, education, that particular demonstration as a means of education. Yeah, but they're not doing it. I'll tell one little story to be kind of careful. There's a gentleman that, I'm not going to give him his name for sure, but he's a very influential Cornellian. He's big, lots of money. He's said to be a billionaire. He came to visit, talked to me, and he wanted to take this on. He did for his family and so forth. And then we were raising some money, maybe for the research component, because he was very much into doing something like that. And I told him he very kindly offered his beautiful home for me to gather some donors. And then said, but he said, show me your protocol first. We saw the protocol. He says, I think it'll work. That's my son's work with the breast cancer. He said, I think it'll work. But then he called back and said, as I was supposedly, you know, gathering some other like-minded donors, please don't tell them I will contribute. And I was stunned. And I said, Bonnie, I said, why? Why would I bring people to your home? Nice gesture. But then I have to tell them you're not going to participate. He said, because people don't want to hear that. That was exactly, literally. People do not want to hear that. That maybe we could control cancer or cure cancer by that means. And the only people I can think of that he's talking about that don't want to hear that are the ones who are invested in the industry. Maybe that's a totally isolated experience, not to be repeated elsewhere. I don't know, but it really struck me as sort of symptomatic of something pretty important here. Yeah, up in the back? No, right, yeah, yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much for being here. So I was paying attention to the correlation of essentially the support for animal protein, the support for pharmaceutical, the support for like that avenue in the world of nutrition, and then like you mentioned, 136 medical referrals possible, none of them having to do with nutrition, and then the decline in tenure for people able to essentially I gather incorporate new knowledge and teach newly from all the information that's out there now, or use their voice freely, the freedom to teach what you want. And looking at that decline, looking at where the money is going and the money trail, and I'm wondering like where you see the future in sharing this kind of information. And what I'm noticing is like maybe a little bit of like, do you see it continuing with institution and institutionalized education, or do you think this is going inevitably into like a grassroots kind of movement?
Yeah, to some extent, yes, there is a so-called grassroots movement now in existence, and it's coming out of the vegetarian and vegan communities for obvious reasons. I have seen just in the last 30 years some changes that are very encouraging. One is the medical, physicians really getting quite interested when they never were trained in this. A second, more mundane or very practical thing. Now, I remember 15 years ago, you couldn't find a cookbook, to tell how to do this. Now there's just, there's recipes all over the place in lots of cookbooks. That's another sort of indication of interest. The third is in restaurants. There's a growing number of restaurants who are, focused on this, at least have an entree or two. That's encouraging. So I see these kind of, and they're not weeds, I think it's real stuff. And that's growing, that's happening. Yeah. But, we still have these institutions. They have their agenda, they are so powerful. I'm going to continue to speak out about them. Mm-hmm. And I know that they won't disappear, I know that. The one thing that troubles me, and the institutions do good things, let's face it. They make money available, and they build stuff we might like to have, and so forth. But at the same time, when it aggregates such power, and everything every thought that passes from the institution by the individuals has to be in line with what that is. It's discouraging. But people begin to change. What they want, what they demand. And what concerns me in the larger context, that means a whole lot of jobs disappearing, if we look at it theoretically. And I just saw an article in the New York Times yesterday, I think it was, talking about this even mere mention of a one-payer system in healthcare that Sanders and others are promoting. Just that talk is enough to cause stock prices in the drug industry to begin to fall. That's sad. And so I think it has to do with the fact that if we got into this business of creating health instead of wealth as a first priority, there's jobs going to be lost. That's what we know now. But we can solve those problems, I think, going forward. New jobs, new ideas, solar energy, if you will, things like that. They can start picking up the slack. I'm not even going to concern myself about that unanswerable question myself. I just want to tell the information because then everybody has a clever idea oftentimes. And just as long as we tell the public, here's what you are listening to. It's not,
Thank you.
Yes, Sam. Sam? Yeah. Oh. Okay.
So in your study, you used casein protein, and I was just wondering if other animal-based proteins contribute equally, like in result, like comparably to
No,
health
that's a difficult
effects?
question really to answer because that presupposes that I was working on rats because I wanted to solve their liver cancer problem. That wasn't the case. It was a model to understand the mechanism, to understand how nutrition works with cancer. So it really had nothing to do with the species in question. If you're talking about other species, let me suggest for your thinking that the biggest, strongest animals in the world eat only plants. Think about the elephant, the rhinoceros, cows, bulls, buffalo. They don't eat plants.
Oh, no,
They make
I was like, I think I misworded my question. I was like saying, if I were to eat like chicken, would it have the same effect on my health as if casein were the,
Oh, I'm sorry.
sorry.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah, I'm going to just say generalized yes. I don't have absolute proof, but I can tell you of one study in particular, Dr. Carroll, who did this, compared about 22 different kinds of proteins, I think, in terms of their ability, about half plants, half animal proteins, in terms of their ability to increase blood cholesterol levels. All the animal proteins sort of were up here, all the plant proteins were here. No overlap. And so then that reminded me of the fact that when in early years, my earlier years, especially even on my own PhD thesis, at that time we had a concept called biological value. In other words, evaluating proteins. And it turns out, I question that now, but in any case, all the animal proteins turned out to have quote unquote high quality protein, and all the plant proteins low quality. You may have heard of it, you had to combine them to show the story of what at that time. And what the lesson to take away from here, the observation itself, just tells me and that and other things that the animal proteins, they do have a composition of amino acids rather like each other. And so all these, and that's the way animal proteins behave. They tend to be pro-inflammatory as a group. They tend to increase growth hormones as a group. They tend to obviously create free radicals, to increase aging and that sort of thing. And that's going to affect a whole host of different diseases, and we tend to see that when we're looking at all these other diseases. I went around the barn on that a bit, but did I answer your question?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Yes. Oh, there's some people over here.
Dr. Campbell, thank you for a lifetime of conviction to the truth. I've read all of your books, and it seems like the path you've taken has sort of been a difficult one. Like you got into science because you wanted to learn the truth. And I'm really excited for your next book to come out based on the titles that you've suggested. It seems to be pulling the curtain back on the sort of the silence that you've been forced to endure. So I'm very excited about that. And you've lived it. I can't wait to hear about it. It seems like you're going to speak to that. One thing that I was always very confused about was you talked about kind of how you used to be here and then your course was just kind of yanked from the catalog. But yet, when people sign up for the online nutrition course, which I looked into doing, it still has the Cornell name attached to it. And I was kind of confused as to is it a Cornell course? Is it your course? And you were silenced in one arena, but you're allowed to speak the truth in another?
Yeah, good question. I'm glad you asked that. I have to answer it first by pointing out that Cornell University is obviously a university, run like a university, and so forth. At the time, and then there's the e-Cornell program, online program. And when that was first proposed, now 20 years ago, 25 years ago, and they put some money into it, I think it was about $2 million, because it was a trend toward that direction. It was met with difficulty, skepticism by the faculty. I was one of the 85%, in fact, had a dim view of what online learning would be. So it got started slowly with difficulty. Here's some money, see what you could do with it kind of thing. So I then, not offering it on campus, I did in one other department, and that was closed. I took it to the online program. And in a fledgling, I should say, a fledgling program at the time, that program was a for-profit entity, totally owned, wholly owned by the university. I think the university made a good move here, to be honest about it. And now we've seen, since then, the evolution of online learning that's getting much more sophisticated. However, that material there is generally not offered for college credit. That's an issue. I've worked on a model myself. I tried it here on the campus, actually. I think it would work. But right now, I would like to see, just put it this way, I would like to see our online program, which we're proud of, be offered to students, for credit, if you will. If you can work out the financials on that kind of thing, it makes sense. But at the present time, we're kind of sitting in that space. We're involved with a for-profit entity, and that's there to make money in part, but they're doing a good job. And so we're very proud of the relationship we have with Cornell. I don't know what the metric is on where we stand, but we heard for quite a while, then a lot more courses came to that organization, and they're doing very well now. I guess we're number one out of a couple hundred courses. So I think we're here to stay. We intend to do better, obviously. We've got a new course now, and I forgot whether I said that or not, on environment and food. Will be coming up, and we've had a new revision of our present program. It just opened officially yesterday, so we'll have that. And we've had about 20,000 graduates, I think. So it's really, it's exciting. And like any other organization, we're continuing to improve and add more. But if you have some ideas on how we can, I had some ideas before I got involved in this, of basically having students elsewhere on other campuses, if they were interested, take the course online, and then get so-called independent study credit at their local university. And that's for the other university to determine what that's worth. It's a model I think in principle should work. But we're still kind of early in this game of online learning.
I think that your explanation of it sort of fosters my own preconceived notion that you're sort of still battling the institution of Cornell University, not allowing freedom of truth to be expressed, and you have to do it in some sort of other avenue to reach the students.
Yeah, I hear you. I'm concerned about it. My own interest in this whole question and the relationship that we have, I certainly have still with university. My main, I got three ideas in mind. I want to make Cornell the distinguished university in this area it once was. Back in my days when I was here, we were ranked #1 in the country, and that we had been ranked that way officially by government bodies for like 30, 40 years. We don't now have that reputation, so I want Cornell to rise to the top. I'm a Cornellian. We've got 7 degrees in my immediate family from this university, so I'm all for, therefore, really making Cornell, the great institution of which it has been in the past. So I just want to say that, just to put it on the record. The other part of it is that it's more troublesome. We got a lot of funding. I got, quite frankly, a generous amount of funding. I was the one that applied for it from the government, from NIH, and we were successful in getting quite a bit of it. It then comes to the institution to administer, to handle the money. And so I feel, in my case, everything I've done is with using public money. Everything I've done, I use no private money. And so I feel responsible for learning what we learned and then having the right to tell the public what we did with our money. I think that's a very important connection that needs to be made. And whatever resistance might occur, and understandably in some cases, I guess you could say, I'm all for construction, not destruction. And so however we can work that out to the benefit of everyone would be a delight. At least that's where I am mentally in this whole thing. I know we all have difficulties one way or another, but if we can use those difficulties to teach lessons and manage something better, then I think that's well worth it.
Thank you for your conviction.
Thank you. Okay. Okay, so I think we're wrapping up now, apparently. You want to say something, Chloe? Or?
Yeah, I was just going to say that we have Cornell samples, like just a few exits to the left, so please feel free to get some. And thank you
Thank you.
today.
Pardon?
I didn't see any of your lecture because the food safety people were giving me such problems.
The food safety people?
They get like, they